Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, the global impact of tax dodging. Are trillions stored in tax havens fueling economic inequality? If you pay tax, you'll be interested in this conversation. If you don't pay tax, you'll be very interested in this conversation. Malika Bilal, what do you have?
Indeed, and there is a lot of anger online about this issue, and I see the word inequality pop up a lot among the tweets we're getting. So for those of you at home, we want you to follow along with the conversation and tweet us your own thoughts. But before that, first, here's a look at some other tax dodging stories that people are sharing online.
Tax havens are places where corporate tax or income tax is extremely low or simply doesn't exist. And those conditions make it very attractive to companies and wealthy individuals who move their profits offshore to avoid paying taxes in their home countries. But a recent report by Oxfam points the finger at tax havens for worsening the gap between rich and poor. So what is the economic impact of tax havens? With us to discuss this via Skype in London, Max Lawson, Head of Global Policy and Campaigns with Oxfam. In Phnom Penh, Cambodia, Daniel Mitchell, a Senior Fellow who studies fiscal policy at the Cato Institute, and that's a Washington, D.C.-based libertarian think tank. In Georgetown, Cayman Islands, Anthony Travers, Chairman of the Cayman Islands Stock Exchange, and in West Palm Beach, Florida, James S. Henry, an investigative economist and senior advisor with the Tax Justice Network. Gentlemen, it's good to have you all here. Dan, if I was a company, a big corporation, and I wanted to do the best for my investors, not pay too much tax, where would I go? Where would I go to put my money, my millions, my billions?
It doesn't really matter where you put your money because governments are going to know about all of it. The question is, what financial planning will you do in terms of your cross-border economic activity? And yes, major multinational companies do like to have tax-neutral platforms to minimize inefficiencies and distortions. And keep in mind that this is very good for the global economy, for there to be more trade, more investment. I object to the whole notion that tax havens are a problem. Low tax jurisdictions are a good thing. The financial crisis that the world is facing is governments that are too big, spending too much, and taxing their economies into economic depression. Look at Greece. That's not the role model we should follow. We should follow the role model of places like Cayman and Hong Kong.
Wow, Dan, you came ready to debate. Oh, okay, so my tax-neutral platform that I would choose, what options do I have?
Well, that's
dozens of options.
All right, lots of options.
I mean, Dan.
Give me some options, gentlemen.
Dan could not be farther wrong. When Apple parks its intellectual property, its patents, in Ireland, the Bermuda, where it barely has any real activity, or when Pfizer does the same thing, like it's now trying to do with Ireland, to avoid U.S. Tax.
Yeah.
It isn't really creating any new economic value. It's simply shifting the patents and intellectual property that they have offshore and then paying themselves royalties tax-free to bolt holds that have basically been created to specialize in offering multinationals very low tax rates. And this is just gaming the international system. It doesn't add any wealth. We've had 30 or 40 years of the growth of the haven industry, sharper reductions in international corporate taxation and individual taxation since the 70s and 80s. And we've seen the global economy has not benefited from this. We've had one financial crisis after another, and now we're going into another one. So it's hard to argue that all this liberalization has been of benefit.
So Anthony,
Yes,
Jim said gaming the system. Here's someone that probably agrees with him online. This is Mehmed. He says, this further enables the 1% to hyper-accumulate their wealth through tax avoidance, while the rest are stuck paying all the taxes. So Anthony, in your view, how does it actually work?
Well, James misunderstands the position completely. The issue of tax minimization comes about in the context you described it, if you use Google and Apple and Starbucks, simply because the OECD double tax treaty networks, which the OECD spent 20 years developing, simply don't work.
And Anthony, let me just interject here, say the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
That's correct. They're an EU-based bunch of bureaucrats sitting in Paris who spent 20 years creating a double tax treaty model which simply doesn't work. And what has happened is that legislators in jurisdictions like Ireland and Luxembourg have gamed the system by passing very, very specific legislation in those jurisdictions to take advantage of these double tax treaty networks, but to minimize the tax that are paying. We can look at the double Irish scheme, for example, the Dutch sandwich, and the special deals done by Luxembourg. But the point here, which
Anthony,
James
let me just
completely,
back up a little bit. Explain one of those examples. Anthony, explain one of those examples, just one of them, so we understand exactly what you're talking about.
What actually happens in the double Irish system is that Irish legislation was specifically developed to attract corporations like Apple to Ireland, to bring in the investment, to bring in the infrastructure, but by the use of non-resident Irish companies, which were not taxable in Ireland, taxation was minimized.
Now, Anthony is a qualified lawyer, so I know he's doing his lawyer speak right now. So if I go to Ireland, do I pay no tax, Anthony, as a corporation?
You would pay no tax in the Irish subsidiaries that were not resident in Ireland by virtue of their management control being outside of Ireland.
All right.
Now that was very specific legislation. The point I want to get to, which James misses and Max missed earlier, is that this is very specific legislation passed by European Union jurisdictions. That is where the tax is minimized or reduced to what some people would regard as levels that are too low. Now, once that minimization process has been effected and the avoidance has been effected, and we have to emphasize that it is done lawfully, because these are Irish laws.
Anthony, make your point, because we've got 3 other people in this conversation and a community who want to jump in with you. Go ahead.
They can talk for as long as they want when I finish.
Yeah.
Once
I'm going to push you. Anthony, we don't have the whole show for you. Go ahead. Just finish your sentence.
It doesn't really matter where the money goes.
All right.
The money's going to go into the international banking system. But the minimization occurs in EU jurisdictions.
All right, Anthony, thank you for that. Let me show you something here on my laptop.
Can I agree?
Yeah.
Which I think would be a bit strange.
Max, I'm going to bring you in because I want people just to understand where you're coming from here as well. This report came out by Oxfam, An Economy for the 1%, how privilege and power in the economy drive extreme inequality and how this can be stopped. Max, what did you want to add?
I wanted to agree, strangely enough. I think the network of secrecy and tax avoidance is not just about the Cayman Islands. It's not just about these treasure islands in the sun. It's just as much about the City of London, where I'm sitting right now. It's just as much about Luxembourg and Ireland, but it is about this complex network that allows rich people and rich corporations to pay virtually no tax. You've got a situation now where a billionaire is paying less tax, a lower effective rate of tax, than a teacher or a nurse. So that means that wealth is being funneled upwards, which is why we can come out with such incredible statistics like the 62 richest people on earth own more wealth now than the bottom half of humanity. That is a very economically inefficient situation where tax is meant to be a progressive thing that generates revenue from the people with the broadest shoulders, the richest people, to spend on schools, hospitals, help the bulk of humanity. Now we've got a situation where the majority of people, ordinary people, are paying their taxes and the people at the top are not paying anything. So that's why we're seeing this huge, extreme growth in inequality, which is helping nobody.
Dan?
Well, he's quite right.
I think there are two mistakes in that analysis. First, if you actually had a reasonable tax system with modest tax rates, people wouldn't have incentives, whether individuals or corporations, there wouldn't be incentives to utilize low tax jurisdictions. So I put the blame not on the Cayman Islands, not on Switzerland, not on Hong Kong. I put the blame on governments that are overtaxing and driving economic activity out. But there's a more fundamental issue here, I think. We should be focusing not on inequality, but poverty instead. Reduce poverty. There already has been good news in the last several decades. Hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of abject poverty. But if we want to reduce poverty even more, we need free markets and small government, not more Orwellian networks of global tax using ever tax rates. That's a recipe for becoming Greece.
I think part of the issue here, Max, is that the public get comments. Yeah, absolutely. Jim, you go first, and I'll go second. Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
I think it's really facile to say that these laws and regulations that apply to this global industry have just been created by governments without any private sector influence. I mean, there's 1,800 tax lobbyists in Washington working for the multinational companies. All of the loopholes that were exploited by Apple and Google and Pfizer and other major multinationals were heavily lobbied during the last 20 years. And they've been responsible for the sharp reductions in effective U.S. corporate taxes for the richest companies. It isn't government just kind of exogenously doing this. This is a big business, and it's a global industry, as Max points out. $21 to $32 trillion offshore of private wealth. We have 2.3 trillion of U.S. corporate profits parked offshore, partly through these tax games by major multinationals. And this is a tax burden that is affecting the poor people, the middle class. There is a irreducible level of public spending that just has to be done on health and defense and education. And if rich people are not going to share in that burden, it's going to lie on the backs of the poor and the middle class. So that's what the issue is.
Jim, I hear you there, but Max, I want to give you two sides of one coin that I'm seeing online. This is Amir, who says tax havens are systematic slavery, strong words there, cloaked under revenue generation. It directly fuels global inequality and widespread corruption. On the other hand, though, this is the pushback argument from Abdul Khalik, who says, when we talk about tax havens, economic freedom and prosperity comes to my mind. Too much taxing of the rich adversely affects the poor. Max, what do you make of that last argument?
I think it's best to quote Warren Buffett, who I think is the second richest man on earth. And he thinks that the system is absolutely crazy when he is paying a lower rate of tax than the secretary in his office. And he checks that every year, and he's still paying 3 years later a lower rate of tax than the secretary in his office. We're living in an upside down world where wealth is being funneled upwards. No one is saying that the richest people on earth should pay punitive rates of tax. I agree that's a disincentive. We're saying they should pay a fair rate of tax, a reasonable rate of tax, just like ordinary people do. And that's the same for businesses too.
What's a reasonable rate of tax, Max? What would be a reasonable rate of tax?
I think, again, I'll quote another billionaire, Bill Gates. Bill Gates has gone on the record saying he thinks that billionaires should pay a 50p rate or 50-cent rate of tax. So 50 cents in the dollar should be paid by billionaires in the US. He thinks it's the first duty of billionaires to pay their taxes. So let's quote the billionaires. They think they should do their duty. There's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't pay a reasonable amount of tax and still stay very, very rich. They'll still have plenty of yachts. They'll still have lots of silk sheets, and they'll still get to go skiing. It'll still be a very nice life at the top.
Let me play you something. This is from a Public Accounts Committee, the Google tax avoidance story that's going on in the UK right now. European President tells MPs he doesn't know how much he's paid. So this parliamentary committee is investigating how Google managed to pay so little tax over the last 10 years. They eventually came up with a sum, and then there was some critique about maybe that sum wasn't enough for the last 10 years. The sum was £130 million. So let me just play you a little bit from the investigative committee from earlier today.
Do you hear the anger and frustration out there that with those huge figures, you settled for a figure of £130 million?
Absolutely, and I welcome the chance to come and talk to you about this. Okay. I understand the anger, and indeed...
Do you really understand the anger, Mr. Britton? What do you get paid, Mr. Britton?
If that's relevant, I'll happily disclose that to the committee. What I understand is...
No, I'm asking you what you get paid.
I'll happily disclose that if that's a relevant matter for the committee in private.
I'm asking you, so it's a relevant matter. Could you tell me what you get paid, please, Mr. Britton?
I don't have the figure, but I'll happily provide it to the committee.
You don't know what you get paid, Mr. Britton?
Chair, let me...
I mean, perhaps you could give us a ballpark of what you get paid. Forget the share options, then. What's your basic salary?
It's a salary. I don't have the figure, but I'll provide the figure privately. If it's relevant to the committee to understand my salary.
I'm sorry. Okay, you don't know what you get paid. Well, my point is, out there, taxpayers, our constituents, are very angry. They live in a different world, clearly, to the world that you live in, if you can't even tell us what you're actually paid.
See, Anthony, there's a lot of anger there. General public around the world get very upset when corporations and very, very rich people pay almost no tax or no tax whatsoever. Do you appreciate the fact that that feels odd in a world where there is a lot of inequality?
I think this discussion's become hugely confused. You firstly got to distinguish rich people from corporations. The sort of tax avoidance mechanisms that I've discussed and we've been talking about are available to corporations and not individuals. Secondly, we have to deal with this shibboleth, this ridiculous ongoing suggestion that in some way rich people hide money offshore. There is complete transparency offshore. There is less transparency in Delaware than there is in the Cayman Islands. There is automatic tax reporting. There are tax information exchange agreements. There is no possibility whatsoever for hiding money offshore. The money that is maintained offshore by U.S. corporations...
Tell that to the UBS clients. Tell that to the Credit Suisse clients.
You're talking about decades
ago,
James. You're talking about decades ago. Let's get real. Let's get real.
I'm talking about 2 years ago.
Let's talk about fact. 2 years ago, they were prosecuted in respect of events which occurred 20, 30, 40 years ago. We've got FATCA now with automatic tax reporting. We've got the Common Reporting Standard with automatic tax reporting. Whatever occurred 20 or 30 years ago doesn't occur now.
That's just
no, it's absolutely true.
There are so many loopholes in the regulations that you describe.
What do you mean?
The EU savings tax, the automatic information exchange. I mean, Switzerland, for example, happily signed up with the United States. But there's no reporting of any gold or vault value or all of the trillions in offshore real estate that's invested in Switzerland. A lot of loopholes in these so-called regulations that you have signed up for, and that you have signed up for.
At some point in your universe, there's just what you have to understand is that a loophole is a function of U.S. legislation. In your example.
I know, and lawyers and tax lobbyists and the industry have nothing to do with those loopholes. Is that right? The financial services industry spends an average of $3,000 per day per congressman on lobbying. They have 1,800 tax lobbyists in Washington, and the Cayman Islands actually also has quite a few of these lobbyists in Washington, as you know. So let's not pretend that these laws are written by some exogenous government agency. They're written.
Well, you've now made that point twice. You've made that
Gentlemen,
point
let
twice.
me just move things along a little bit. So, Anthony and Jim, let me just move things on a little bit. So, Malika, where do you want to take us?
Well, there's a discussion online about how this conversation we're having affects your average everyday taxpayer. So this is one idea from FTC, who says tax havens proliferate tax dodging, which robs government coffers of billions of dollars each year, and that should be spent on development. But Daniel, there's pushback in the form of a tweet from Ibrahim, who says, in most African countries, a mass generalization there, but this person writes in that taxes are collected and then corruptly mismanaged. So it's a double-edged sword. What do you make of that argument? And is this money that could be going towards development, or would it not go there anyway?
I think that's a really good point. I've lived for many years in Africa myself.
Is a huge problem in Africa and other developed countries.
So, gentlemen, Dan and Jim, I hear you. Let Max go first, and I'll let you get second and third. So, Max, go ahead. You take it away, first of all.
I think that's a really, really important point. And I lived for many years in Africa myself, and I think you need to take corruption incredibly seriously. Africa loses 15 billion in potential tax revenues because of tax avoidance each year. That's just from rich individuals. That's the kind of money that could save 4 million lives each year. That's in our report. The economy for the 1% is the kind of money that could put every child in school. But that's not automatic. The way that would happen is for citizens to hold their governments to account for the kind of activity that you saw then in the UK Parliament to happen in countries across Africa.
Max, let's just hear what Daniel has to say about that. Dan, go ahead.
Two things. First, why don't we all just agree to have a simple and fair flat tax so there's no more loopholes, no exemptions, no deductions?
No, because the rich should pay more
one time
than the poor.
with a very
That's
low rate where there'd be very high levels of compliance. But then you get to the more fundamental issue that I think underscores all these discussions.
Unfair.
Should we travel down the path of becoming more like Greece and Italy?
So, Jim, hold tight for a moment. Dan, make a very succinct point. Jim, hold tight for a moment.
I don't think
Dan, make a very succinct point. Go ahead.
We should not allow the world to become Greece. And some of our friends on the left on this program seem to think there's no limit to how big government should get and how high taxes should be. And that's a path to economic destruction. The world is a laboratory. Low taxes and small governments are the way to reduce poverty and increase prosperity for everyone.
Jim?
Yeah, that's worked so well.
Greece became Greece for a lot of reasons, but it wasn't because of taxation. It was because of, among other things, tax avoidance aided by the Swiss with respect to the wealthiest Greek shipowning.
But taxes were still more than 45% of GDP.
So here's the thing, gentlemen.
An enormous.
Here's the thing, gentlemen. Dan, are you happy with what we have right now? Are you happy with the status quo, with the what do you call them, tax-neutral platforms we have around the world? Are you happy with what we have right now? Could there be room for improvement?
I'm glad there are still some low-tax jurisdictions around the world, but I'm very pessimistic and sad about what's happening to the global economy with governments growing ever bigger. Governments are bigger now than during the fiscal crisis when they spent the world into an economic catastrophe. And some of our friends on this program on the left want to simply make taxes even bigger and make government even bigger. And look, Greece doesn't work. Italy doesn't work. France doesn't work. Hong Kong, Switzerland, Ireland, the Cayman Islands, those are the role models if we actually care about people having prosperity and opportunity.
Are you suggesting that there would be lower taxes? If there were lower taxes, there wouldn't be tax havens?
We should all become tax havens.
Dan?
We should all become tax havens, but most importantly, we need to control the size of government because we're seeing around the world that government spending is driving economies into collapse, especially with demographic changes, aging populations. We can't afford these bloated welfare states anymore. And people like that politician who is harassing the Google executive, she's the problem, not him. His money is earned voluntarily. She wants to coercively tax everyone.
Living in the 1980s. Dan is living in the 1980s. We've had substantial reductions in the size of government apart from financial crises. And those crises have not been caused by government. They've been caused by the private sector and by the banking industry and by the lack of regulation on the part of government. So, the reason money is pouring out of China right now. The financial crisis was caused by government, easy money policy, and the regulation.
So, gentlemen, let me just go back to Max here. Max, with this Oxfam report, it's kind of pointing the finger at tax havens or tax-neutral platforms, as Dan called them. What did you want to actually happen right at the end of the show? So make this very succinct. What did you want to happen? Did you want to change this?
I think we need to see, the extreme inequality that we see today and this network of secrecy, this network of tax havens that means the richest people and the richest corporations pay less tax than ordinary people was the product of deliberate choices. And it doesn't have to be there. We can end the era of tax havens and we can stop this happening. I think the rich should pay their fair share like everybody else, and the world will be a better place.
Max Lawson, Daniel Mitchell, Anthony Travers and James S. Henry, we are not done yet. I'm taking you online to stream.adzero.com to be continued. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hello again, this is the Streams Online Post Show. We're talking about tax havens and the impact on economies around the world. Let's get right back to that conversation. Anthony, if I mentioned reform and tax havens, do you feel that there needs to be any?
Oh, the point is there has been, and we're dealing with these ludicrous suggestions from Max and James that secrecy is still an issue, and in some way people are hiding things. We've had FATCA, we've had the Common Reporting Standard. There's complete transparency in the Cayman Islands with regard to financial accounting matters. And even Cyrus Vance, the Attorney General for the state of New York, has recently said before a congressional subcommittee that they have greater transparency in the Cayman Islands than they have in Delaware. So the fact of it is that tax authorities have complete ability to ascertain the financial account position in jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands today. James said that may not have been the case 20, 30 years ago in Switzerland. He's correct about that. But now there are transparency treaties,
when I first went to the Cayman
and
Islands,
secrecy is
wasn't the
simply
case.
off the
Listen,
table.
can we respond? Can I respond?
Yeah, go ahead. You're doing it right now.
I mean, it's just not the case that the Cayman Islands, if you look on the financialsecrecyindex.com, we publish a survey of 91 havens. Cayman Islands comes in 5th. It is better off than Delaware. That's a very low standard. You still don't publish country-by-country reports. You have unilateral tax cuts. You don't have, under the FATCA, you don't have, or under the OECD standard, you haven't agreed to exchange information on a reciprocal basis with developing countries. You don't publish company accounts. You have an unlimited number of directors for hedge funds. That's one of the reasons why a lot of the hedge funds like Bear Stearns, which failed in 2008, chose to locate their SPVs in the Cayman Islands. I just came back from South Africa, and I came across a scheme that had been concocted by Morgan Stanley and a bunch of promoters to help wealthy South Africans generate more than 500 million rand of bogus tax credits. Where did they put their special purpose vehicle? In the Cayman Islands, sir, and it's still operating. So, it's not just about taxes. It's about financial secrecy, and it's about corporate governance. And you have designed a country strategy which is based on financial chicanery.
That's complete and utter nonsense from start to finish. The Cayman Islands has over $2 trillion of assets invested in hedge funds, invested by the major corporations in the world. It has some of the highest standards of governance. Do you really think those corporations, who are some of the most sophisticated investors on the planet, would be investing in the Cayman Islands if you thought there was poor governance?
Yes, that's absolutely why they're investing in the Cayman Islands. Why on earth would they want to invest in you for any other reason? They want to save tax and hide.
You couldn't be more
That's
wrong,
what
because
they're doing
every
it for.
penny that is invested in the Cayman Islands that results in
Frankly
profits being
speaking,
generated
they're
in
not
the
really
United
interested
States or
in
the
you for
United
any
Kingdom
other reason.
has
All right,
full
so
tax
gentlemen,
paid the United States, the United Kingdom in accordance with the United States law and United Kingdom law.
All right, so gentlemen, I'm going to move things on a little bit.
The Cayman Islands has full tax paid on it.
Anthony's very proud of the way that the Cayman Islands is running right now. Anthony, and the Cayman Islands is not the only place where you can put your money where you will have a very low rate of tax or no tax. So let's not all beat up on Anthony because he's in the conversation and very generously so. Moving on, Malika.
Well, there are people online that say even if the Cayman Islands is a place where secrecy is not an issue there is room for improvement in other places. So I want to play you a video comment from someone who has some suggestions for some of these other places. This is Nadia, and I'll play this for you, Daniel.
In Europe, tax dodging by the super rich and also by multinationals such as McDonald's, which are paying as little as 1% of corporate tax, is definitely a big problem. As trade unions, we have long-standing demands to fix the problem. We need a common corporate tax, not only a common corporate tax base to avoid loopholes, but also a minimum corporate tax rate of at least 25%.
Daniel, is that realistic? And who would even enact that minimum corporate tax rate?
Well, she's being very honest. She wants bigger government, and therefore she wants tax harmonization. She wants to force every jurisdiction in the world to have a tax rates of a certain level. And I think that kind of global tax cartel would be very destructive to the interests of people all around the world. Prosperity isn't created by government. Prosperity is created by the private sector. And these people who want to make the entire world like one big Greece or France, the problem is big government. And this is really what this debate with Max and Jim is about. They want a much higher tax burden and a much bigger public sector. And I just think becoming Greece and Italy is not a good recipe for the rest of the world.
Dan, we've tried debt, we've tried inflation, we've tried privatization. Last year, the top 50 billionaires in the United States gave a grand total of charitable contributions of $7 billion. That's about as much as we spend in Afghanistan in 1 month. If you look at developing countries and you line them up, you know, the richest countries in the world all have tax burdens on the order of 30% of GDP. Nobody's talking about confiscatory taxation here. But the poorest countries in the world only get about 10% of GDP to tax. So according to your theory, Haiti should be growing like Topsy. It's a libertarian paradise. It has no effective government, no public schools, no public health system, and the judges are for sale. That's your idea of paradise.
If you look at the jurisdictions that have gone from poverty to wealth, there are places like Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore. Show me a single country anywhere in the world that became rich with big government. Even France and Greece, when they grew, they had small government.
Singapore has 5 million people, Dan. You can't generalize that to China. You need strategies.
Look at the United States.
Like the United States
became a rich country when government was very,
the United
small.
States is a tax haven. United States is a tax haven. So is the Cayman Islands.
So, gentlemen, this is what I don't understand. If I may just interject in a moment. I'm enjoying your back and forth, but
there's a global.
Jim, if I may, what I don't understand, Jim and Max, is how do you make this work on a global scale? Because each country, each region has their own way of dealing with.
Since 2010,
with banking,
roughly, we have made.
And many of this is legal.
As Anthony suggests, we have made progress, and I want to compliment the Cayman Islands on some of the. No, legal is in the eyes of the beholder. I mean, legal is defined by lobbyists in this area. It's incredibly complicated. You know, you can't use the legality of something as any kind of issue. There's all kinds of stuff that was once legal that is no longer legal. I mean, slavery was once legal in the United States. You know, so in this situation, we have a very influential lobby that is writing the laws and then turning around and saying, hey, what we're doing is legal.
Yeah.
You need to accept responsibility, James. This is your system. This is your U.S. government. They're your lobbyists. It's your law. And if you don't apply taxation in accordance with the strict letter of the law,
well, I mean,
you resort to mob rule, which has no part in it.
Stop
talking when I'm talking.
This is a global
industry. Stop talking when I am talking. Wait till I have finished. If you do not apply the strict letter of the law with regard to matters of taxation, you resort to mob rule.
Oh, well, I don't know.
Can I say something?
Don't like democracy in the Cayman Islands.
Gentlemen, I'm about to wrap up. Max, what do you want to say? I'm going to give you the last word.
I just want to give a message of hope. I think there has been progress. I think the publics of the most powerful nations on earth, in Europe, in the United States, are increasingly very, very angry about big corporations paying very, very little tax. And I think once we start to see politicians listening to the majority on this and not to the wealthy minority, and starting to put pressure on tax havens, on secrecy jurisdictions, then we can see progress on this issue. It's not impossible to see a reverse of the trend of the last 20 years, and it's not impossible to see the rich and corporations pay their fair share. This is not an impossible problem, and it's something that can be fixed. And I'm very, very
That's
optimistic.
great.
I
So
think
we're going to get more class
today,
warfare taxation.
This is not about class warfare. It's about the rich paying their fair share.
It's about class warfare and driving
that's
the world into
we're
poverty
headed for.
with excessive government. You want the
reasonable
world to become
world
Greece. I think that is
rich
horrible
class warfare
to do
initiated
to the people
by
of the world.
ruling classes.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure listening to you as a quartet of voices. I think we've had quite a lot of billionaires in one show. You're just going to make me jealous. Max, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Warren Buffett said that we've already got class warfare. This is Warren Buffett saying this. We already have class warfare.
Warren Buffett's a crony capitalist who got $5 billion of handouts from the U.S. government. He's in the pockets of the U.S. government. If Bill Gates really thinks 50% tax is okay, why isn't he paying that himself? You quoting a couple of in bed with government crony capitalists, and that's exactly the problem you have.
If you don't like billionaires, I'm not sure who you do like.
Too powerful.
Gentlemen, it has been an exhilarating conversation with you all. Thank you very much. I'm not going to ask for any closing statements because we don't have time. Yeah, yes. Max Lawson, Daniel Mitchell, Anthony Travers, and James S. Henry. It's been really interesting hearing your very, very vibrant debate amongst each other. Really appreciate your time this afternoon. And Malika, what do you have?
I'll give the last word to Tove Maria, who has a solution. She says the first important step towards tax justice, multinational corporations must publish what tax they pay and what business they do in each country where they operate.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Take care.